On October 1, 1901, General Jacob Hurd Smith stood on the deck of a ship bound for Samar Island in the Philippines. He was 61 years old, a veteran of the Civil War and decades of Indian wars on the American frontier. He had been given command of a military operation with a specific mission: to retaliate for the massacre of American soldiers at Balangiga just days earlier, and to pacify the island of Samar once and for all. What happened next would become one of the darkest chapters in American military history. Smith gave orders that were genocidal in their intent and language. He told his officers he wanted Samar turned into a howling wilderness. He said he wanted no prisoners, and when asked about the age limit for killing, he reportedly said 10 years old, that anyone capable of bearing arms against the United States should be killed. The campaign that followed, lasting from October 1901 through the spring of 1902, saw American forces sweep across Samar, burning villages, destroying crops, killing civilians, and implementing a strategy of systematic devastation aimed at making the island uninhabitable for guerrillas by making it uninhabitable for everyone. Thousands of Filipinos died, entire communities disappeared, and the island's population was reduced by perhaps 20 to 30%. This is the story of the march across Samar, of how an American general gave orders that would be recognized today as war crimes, of how those orders were carried out by American soldiers who believed they were avenging their comrades and following legitimate commands, and of how the consequences of those terrible weeks echo across more than a century. To understand why Smith gave the orders he did, you need to understand what had just happened at Balangiga, and you need to understand who Jacob Smith was. The Balangiga massacre occurred on September 28, 1901, when Filipino guerrillas launched a surprise attack on Company C of the 9th U.S. Infantry Regiment. Using machetes and bolos, the guerrillas killed 48 American soldiers in brutal close-quarters combat during breakfast. It was one of the worst American defeats in the Philippine-American War, and news of it shocked American forces throughout the Philippines. The bodies of the American soldiers had been badly mutilated, hacked with machetes, with some having dozens of wounds. The attack happened during breakfast, which Americans saw as particularly treacherous. The fact that the guerrillas had used deception, smuggling fighters into the town disguised as civilians and hiding weapons, made it seem like a violation of the rules of civilized warfare. American soldiers and officers were furious and demanded revenge. Jacob Smith was chosen to lead that revenge because he had a reputation for ruthlessness and for winning ugly campaigns. Smith had been at Wounded Knee in 1890 when the U.S. Army massacred Lakota Sioux. He had spent years fighting in the Indian Wars, where the military's strategy often involved destroying Native American villages, killing livestock, and creating conditions where resistance was impossible because survival was impossible. Smith brought this experience and this mindset to Samar. He saw the Filipinos the same way he had seen Native Americans, as savage enemies who couldn't be negotiated with, only defeated through overwhelming force and terror. His worldview was shaped by decades of frontier warfare, where the line between combatants and civilians was deliberately blurred, and where collective punishment was standard practice. Smith arrived in Samar in early October with clear orders from his superiors to pacify the island. But what pacification meant was left somewhat vague, and Smith interpreted it in the harshest possible terms. He met with his subordinate commanders and laid out his vision for the campaign. The accounts of what Smith said come from the court-martial that would eventually prosecute him and from testimony by officers who were present. According to Major Littleton Waller, who would lead much of the actual fighting, Smith's orders were explicit and shocking. Smith said he wanted the interior of Samar made a howling wilderness. He wanted all persons killed who were capable of bearing arms, and he said he wanted all food and shelter destroyed. When Waller asked for clarification about who should be killed, Smith said everyone over the age of 10. Waller, according to his later testimony, was taken aback and said that these orders seemed harsh. Smith replied that the more killing and burning, the more it would please him, and that the interior of Samar must be made a desert. These orders, if followed literally, would mean killing the vast majority of Samar's population. The island had hundreds of thousands of people, and nearly everyone over 10 would be capable of bearing arms by Smith's broad definition. The orders were genocidal. They targeted an entire population, not just combatants or even just adult males, but everyone over 10, including women, teenagers, and elderly people. Smith's logic was that if you killed everyone who could support the guerrillas and destroyed all the food and shelter, the guerrillas would have nowhere to hide and nothing to eat, and resistance would collapse. This logic ignored the humanity of the people who would be killed and displaced. It treated Samar's entire civilian population as the enemy and as legitimate targets for extermination. It's important to note that there's some historical debate about the exact wording of Smith's orders, and whether he literally meant kill everyone over 10 or whether this was hyperbolic language meant to convey harshness but not literal genocide. Smith himself later claimed at his court-martial that he had been misunderstood, that he didn't literally mean to kill all civilians, just to be harsh with guerrillas and their supporters. But multiple officers testified that Smith had indeed given these orders in approximately these words, and Smith's subsequent actions and his approval of extreme violence suggest that whatever the exact words, the intent was clear: maximum violence against the civilian population of Samar to crush resistance through terror. Major Littleton Waller was the officer tasked with carrying out Smith's orders. Waller was a Marine officer, a veteran of campaigns in Cuba and China, known for aggressive tactics and personal bravery. He took command of a Marine battalion and army units and began operations across Samar in October 1901. Waller's mission was to march through the interior of the island, find and destroy guerrilla forces, eliminate their support base, and make continued resistance impossible. He had roughly 300 Marines and a larger number of army soldiers under his overall command, though the forces were divided into multiple columns that operated somewhat independently. The strategy for the Samar campaign was coordinated devastation. Multiple American columns would sweep through different parts of the island simultaneously, converging on areas where guerrilla activity was strongest. The columns would burn villages, destroy crops, kill livestock, and engage any armed resistance they encountered. The goal was to deny the guerrillas everything they needed to survive: food, shelter, information, and popular support, by destroying the civilian infrastructure that sustained them. This wasn't a new strategy. It had been used by Sherman's March to the Sea during the Civil War and in various Indian Wars campaigns, but it was being applied with unusual thoroughness and brutality on Samar because of the anger over Balangiga, and because Smith's orders explicitly called for maximum destruction. The march across Samar began in earnest in October and continued through the winter and into early 1902, American forces moved through the interior in multiple columns. They followed trails that Filipino forced laborers had been made to cut through the jungle before the Balangiga attack. They moved through valleys and over mountains, through dense jungle and across rivers. The terrain was difficult, hot and humid, with thick vegetation that limited visibility and made movement slow. The Americans were constantly alert for ambushes, though major combat was actually relatively rare, because the Filipino guerrillas, having learned from earlier battles that they couldn't stand against American firepower, mostly avoided direct engagement. What the American forces did find over and over were villages. Samar had hundreds of small communities scattered throughout the interior, farming and fishing villages where people had lived for generations. These villages became the primary targets of the American campaign. The pattern was consistent. American troops would approach a village. Sometimes they would be fired on by guerrillas who were in or near the village, which the Americans took as proof that the village supported the guerrillas. Sometimes there was no resistance, but the Americans assumed the village must be supporting guerrillas anyway because nearly every village did. The Americans would search the village for weapons, for hidden guerrillas, for food caches. Then they would order the villagers out, giving them sometimes just minutes to gather whatever possessions they could carry. And then the Americans would burn the village to the ground. Houses, churches, storage buildings, everything would be set on fire. Crops in nearby fields would be destroyed. Livestock would be killed or confiscated. The message was clear: any community in the interior of Samar would be destroyed. The only way to avoid destruction was to move to the coast, where American forces could control and monitor the population. The destruction was systematic and thorough. Officers kept logs of villages burned, and the numbers are staggering. Dozens of villages were destroyed in the first weeks of the campaign. By the end, hundreds of communities had been burned. Entire valleys were depopulated. Areas that had been inhabited for centuries became empty, the only signs of previous habitation being overgrown ruins and abandoned fields. The Americans didn't just burn buildings. They destroyed food supplies that couldn't be carried away. They burned rice stores, the grain that was essential for survival. They cut down fruit trees and destroyed root crops. They killed pigs, chickens, and caribou, the water buffalo that were essential for farming. The goal was to make the land unable to support human life, or at least unable to support guerrillas. The human cost of this strategy was catastrophic. The villagers who were driven from their homes had to flee with whatever they could carry, often just the clothes on their backs. They became refugees in their own land, trying to make their way to coastal areas where they might find safety in American-controlled zones. Many didn't make it. The trails were difficult, especially for children, elderly people, and the sick. People died of exhaustion, of starvation, of disease. Those who reached the coast found themselves in concentration camps, the protected zones where civilians from the interior were forced to relocate. These camps were overcrowded, unsanitary, and desperately short of food because the Americans had destroyed the food supplies in the interior. Diseases like cholera and malaria swept through the camps. Death rates were horrific. Thousands died not from bullets, but from starvation and disease, resulting from the deliberate destruction of their communities and food supplies. American soldiers who participated in the campaign wrote letters home describing what they were doing. Some wrote with pride about the thoroughness of the destruction. They talked about burning villages and destroying food supplies as military necessities, as unfortunate but required actions to defeat the guerrillas. They saw themselves as avenging Balangiga and as doing hard work that civilians back home wouldn't understand, but that was necessary for victory. Other soldiers were more troubled. Some letters show awareness that what they were doing was wrong, that burning villages and destroying food that civilians needed to survive crossed moral lines. But even troubled soldiers generally continued to follow orders, either because they believed orders must be followed, because they feared punishment for disobedience, or because the logic of collective action made individual resistance seem pointless. The guerrillas themselves were rarely encountered in major battles. Filipino forces on Samar adopted a strategy of avoidance. They broke into small bands and hid in the deep jungle where American forces couldn't easily follow. They launched occasional small-scale attacks on isolated American units or supply lines, but they avoided the kind of direct engagement that would allow American firepower to devastate them. This strategy frustrated the Americans because it meant the main targets they found were not guerrilla fighters, but civilian villages. The Americans justified attacking villages by saying they supported the guerrillas, which was often true. Villages did provide food, shelter, and information to Filipino fighters. But providing support to guerrillas, whether voluntary or coerced, doesn't make an entire village a legitimate military target, especially not the women, children, and elderly who made up much of the population. Major Waller led one of the most infamous episodes of the Samar campaign, though this incident was separate from the general destruction and involved his own Marines rather than Filipino civilians. In December 1901, Waller led an expedition to cross Samar from the south coast to the north coast to scout a potential telegraph route. The expedition turned into a disaster. The terrain was more difficult than expected. The Marines ran out of food. The jungle was so dense they could barely make progress. Men began dying of exhaustion, starvation, and disease. Waller became convinced that their Filipino guides and porters were deliberately leading them astray, trying to kill them through exhaustion and starvation. When the expedition finally reached safety after losing several Marines, Waller ordered the execution of 11 Filipino guides and porters as punishment for their alleged treachery. The executions were done by firing squad without any formal legal process, without courts-martial or trials. Waller would later be court-martialed for these executions, though he would be acquitted on the grounds that he was following Smith's orders to take no prisoners and that he had been under extreme stress. The question of prisoners is crucial to understanding the Samar campaign. Smith's orders said he wanted no prisoners, which in the context of his other orders to kill everyone over 10, implied that captured guerrillas and possibly captured civilians should be executed rather than held. This would be a clear violation of the laws of war, which required humane treatment of prisoners even in colonial conflicts. In practice, how this order was followed varied. Some American units did execute prisoners, either immediately after capture or after brief interrogation. Other units ignored the order and took prisoners who were sent to prison camps. But the order's existence and Smith's repeated emphasis on harsh measures created an environment where killing prisoners was seen as acceptable by at least some American forces. The exact number of prisoners or suspected guerrillas executed during the Samar campaign will never be known, but testimony from the courts-martial and reports from various units suggest it was substantial. The use of torture was routine during the Samar campaign. The water cure, the technique where prisoners were forced to drink enormous quantities of water until their stomachs distended and then were beaten to force the water out, was used systematically to extract information about guerrilla locations and activities. Other torture methods were also employed. Prisoners were beaten, subjected to mock executions, threatened with death if they didn't provide information. The torture was often ineffective because terrified people would say anything to make it stop, providing false information just to satisfy their interrogators. But the practice continued because officers demanded intelligence and because the culture of the Samar campaign, with its emphasis on harshness and revenge, made torture seem acceptable. The Catholic Church became a particular target during the Samar campaign because Filipino priests were often involved in organizing resistance. Churches were seen as centers of guerrilla support and anti-American activity. American forces burned churches along with villages. They confiscated or destroyed religious items. The church bells of Balangiga were taken as war trophies and sent to American military bases where they would remain for over a century. The targeting of churches was seen as necessary by American commanders who believed the Catholic Church was organizing resistance, but it was also motivated by anti-Catholic prejudice among many American soldiers who were Protestant and saw Catholicism as superstitious and un-American. The destruction of churches was a profound violation for the deeply Catholic Filipino population. It was an attack not just on buildings, but on their faith and cultural identity. The death toll from the Samar campaign is difficult to calculate precisely, but all estimates are horrific. The most conservative estimates suggest several thousand civilians died directly from violence, starvation, and disease during the campaign. More expansive estimates run into the tens of thousands. The population of Samar before the campaign was perhaps 200,000 to 300,000. Estimates suggest the population declined by 20 to 30% during the campaign and its immediate aftermath, which would mean 40,000 to 90,000 deaths. Some of this population loss was from people fleeing to other islands, but most was from death. The causes of death were varied. Some people were shot by American soldiers. Some died in the burning of villages. But the vast majority died from starvation and disease in the concentration camps or while fleeing through the jungle. These deaths were the intended consequence of Smith's strategy. By destroying food supplies and villages, he created conditions where mass death was inevitable. The environmental impact of the campaign was also severe. Large areas of Samar were deliberately deforested to deny cover to guerrillas. Trees were cut down, vegetation was burned, entire forest areas were cleared. This deforestation had lasting ecological consequences, changing water flow patterns, increasing erosion, and destroying habitat. The destruction of agriculture, the killing of livestock, and the abandonment of fields meant that even after the campaign ended, it took years for Samar's agricultural economy to recover. The island went from being a food-producing area to one dependent on external food supplies. The economic devastation matched the human devastation. General Smith's role during the campaign was to oversee operations, to ensure his subordinates were following his orders for harshness, and to approve increasingly extreme measures. He visited various parts of Samar, inspected operations, and communicated with his officers. Reports from the field were sent to Smith, and he approved the tactics being used. He praised officers who were particularly thorough in destruction. He pushed for more aggressive action when he felt units weren't being harsh enough. Smith was not personally burning villages or shooting civilians, but he was the architect and driving force behind a campaign of systematic devastation. The campaign reflected his vision, his orders, and his values. But even as the campaign was achieving its objectives in terms of destroying guerrilla infrastructure and breaking organized resistance, news of what was happening on Samar was beginning to reach the broader American public. Reports from officers, letters from soldiers, and accounts from journalists who visited Samar described the destruction and the harsh tactics. The anti-imperialist movement in the United States, which had been criticizing the Philippine-American War since it began, seized on Samar as proof that imperialism was corrupting American values. Reports of Smith's orders, particularly the kill everyone over 10 order, created a scandal. Newspapers ran stories with headlines about American atrocities. Editorial cartoons depicted American soldiers as barbarians. The pressure for accountability grew. The military command in the Philippines and in Washington faced a dilemma. They wanted the guerrillas on Samar defeated, and Smith's campaign was achieving that goal. Organized resistance on Samar was collapsing under the pressure of systematic destruction, but the tactics being used were creating a public relations disaster. The military needed to show that it took the rules of war seriously and that it would punish officers who went too far, even if going too far had been effective. So investigations were launched and courts-martial were convened. Major Waller was court-martialed first in March 1902 for the execution of the 11 Filipino guides during his disastrous expedition across the island. The trial was held in Manila and attracted significant attention. Waller's defense was that he had been following General Smith's orders to take no prisoners, and that under extreme circumstances, with his men dying and believing the guides were deliberately sabotaging the expedition, he had made a hard decision that he believed was authorized by his commanding officer. The prosecution argued that executing prisoners without trial was murder regardless of what orders Waller believed he had. The court-martial board, composed of military officers who understood the pressures of the field and who were sympathetic to Waller's situation, acquitted him. The verdict suggested that the military was not serious about punishing officers for harsh tactics, and it created more public outrage. General Smith's court-martial followed in May 1902. He was charged with conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline for giving orders that violated the laws of war. The specific charge focused on his orders to kill everyone over 10 and to take no prisoners. The trial became a public spectacle, with newspapers covering it extensively. Officers who had served under Smith testified about the orders they had received. The prosecution presented Smith's orders as clearly illegal and as having led to widespread atrocities. Smith's defense argued that his language had been misunderstood, that he hadn't literally meant to kill all civilians, that his orders were harsh but necessary in fighting guerrillas, and that he had been under pressure to achieve results after Balangiga. He portrayed himself as a soldier doing an impossible job under difficult circumstances and as a victim of anti-imperialist propaganda. The court-martial board found Smith guilty, but the punishment was remarkably light. Smith was sentenced to be admonished by the reviewing authority and forced to retire. That was it. No prison time, no reduction in rank, no significant consequences beyond early retirement with full pension. The sentence was a joke, and it was widely recognized as such. The military establishment had convicted Smith for show, to demonstrate that it cared about the laws of war, but the trivial punishment showed that it didn't really care, or at least that it cared less about war crimes than it cared about supporting officers who achieved military objectives. The light sentences in the Waller and Smith courts-martial sent clear messages. To soldiers and officers in the field, the message was that harsh tactics would be tolerated and even tacitly approved as long as they were effective. You might face a court-martial if things became too public, but the punishment would be minimal. To the Filipino population, the message was that American lives mattered, but Filipino lives didn't, that killing American soldiers would bring terrible retribution, but killing Filipino civilians would bring no real consequences for the perpetrators. To the American public, the message was that the military would investigate itself and find itself largely innocent, that accountability was mostly for show. The Samar campaign achieved its immediate military objectives. Organized guerrilla resistance on the island collapsed. The destruction of villages and food supplies made it impossible for guerrilla bands to survive in the interior. Filipino fighters either surrendered, fled to other islands, or died from starvation and disease. By mid-1902, American forces controlled Samar, and active resistance had ended. From a purely military perspective, the campaign was successful. It achieved the goal of pacification, but the costs were enormous and the methods were criminal. The impact on Samar's survivors was profound and lasting. People who had lived through the campaign, who had seen their villages burned and their families killed, carried trauma for the rest of their lives. Children who witnessed the destruction grew up with memories of American soldiers as brutal occupiers. The social fabric of communities was destroyed along with the physical villages. Traditional authorities had been killed or discredited. Economic life had been shattered. Trust between neighbors was damaged by forced choices about collaboration. The psychological scars went deep, affecting how people related to each other, how they viewed authority, and how they understood their place in the world. The campaign also had lasting economic effects. Samar had been a relatively prosperous agricultural area before the war. After the campaign, it was one of the poorest parts of the Philippines. The destruction of infrastructure, the loss of livestock and tools, the depopulation, and the disruption of trade networks set Samar's economy back by decades. It took years for agricultural production to recover to pre-war levels. The island remained economically depressed and underdeveloped for generations. While other factors contributed to Samar's poverty, including geography and lack of investment, the devastation of the American campaign was a major cause of long-term underdevelopment. Politically, the campaign affected how Filipinos viewed America and how they participated in or resisted the colonial government that was being established. Some Filipinos, seeing the overwhelming force and ruthlessness America was willing to use, concluded that cooperation was the only realistic option and became collaborators. They worked within the colonial system, seeking positions in the government and opportunities in the economy America was creating. Others remained bitter and resistant, working against American interests when possible and maintaining a commitment to genuine independence. The divide between collaborators and resistors created tensions within Filipino society that persisted throughout the colonial period. The campaign also influenced American military doctrine and thinking about counterinsurgency. The Samar campaign was studied as an example of how to break an insurgency through the systematic destruction of its support base. The tactics used: population control through concentration, destruction of resources, aggressive patrolling, harsh punishment of resistance, became part of the toolkit that American forces would use in future counterinsurgency campaigns. But the campaign also became a cautionary tale about going too far, about tactics that might be militarily effective in the short term, but that create such resentment and suffering that they undermine long-term political goals. The tension between these two lessons, that harsh tactics can work militarily, but that they carry unacceptable costs, has never been fully resolved in American military thinking. The question of whether Smith's orders constituted genocide is complex and depends on how you define genocide. The legal definition of genocide in international law, established by the Genocide Convention after World War II, requires specific intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part. Smith's orders targeted the population of Samar, which could be considered a subset of the Filipino people defined by geography. His orders aimed to kill everyone over 10 and to destroy the ability of the population to survive by eliminating food and shelter. This fits the pattern of genocidal intent. However, Smith would likely argue, and did argue at his trial, that his intent was military, to defeat guerrillas, not to destroy Filipinos as a people. The line between harsh counterinsurgency and genocide is not always clear, but Smith's orders were at least genocidal in character, if not strictly genocide, under the later legal definition. What's clear is that Smith's orders violated the laws of war as they existed in 1901. The Hague Convention, which the United States had signed, required humane treatment of prisoners and protection of civilians. The U.S. Army's own regulations, based on the Lieber Code from the Civil War, prohibited killing prisoners and required that military necessity not justify unlimited violence. Smith's orders violated all of these rules. He ordered the killing of prisoners. He ordered the killing of civilians, including women and teenagers and elderly people over 10. He ordered the destruction of civilian property and food supplies beyond any reasonable military necessity. These were war crimes, and his conviction at court-martial, however light the sentence, was an acknowledgement of that fact. The Samar campaign also raises questions about command responsibility and how far up the chain of command accountability should go. Smith gave the orders, but he was acting with at least tacit approval from his superiors. He had been sent to Samar specifically to conduct harsh retaliation for Balangiga. His immediate superior, General Adna Chaffee, knew Smith's reputation and must have known the campaign would be brutal. The civilian leadership, including William Howard Taft, who was Governor General of the Philippines, and President Theodore Roosevelt, received reports about what was happening on Samar. Yet none of Smith's superiors were court-martialed or significantly punished. The military and civilian leadership sacrificed Smith to public pressure while protecting itself, a pattern that would repeat in future scandals involving American military atrocities. Remembering Samar today involves holding multiple truths in tension. The Balangiga massacre happened, and it was a brutal attack that killed 48 American soldiers. The anger and desire for revenge that American forces felt were real. Guerrilla warfare is genuinely difficult and frustrating, and the challenge of fighting an enemy that hides among civilians is real. These facts don't justify what happened on Samar, but they provide context. At the same time, what Smith ordered and what American forces did on Samar was criminal. Ordering the killing of everyone over 10 is indefensible. Deliberately creating conditions leading to mass starvation is indefensible. Burning hundreds of villages and destroying the food supplies that civilians needed to survive is indefensible. Both things are true. The Americans faced a difficult military problem, and they responded with war crimes that killed thousands of civilians. The memory of Samar is kept alive in the Philippines through commemorations, through teaching in schools, through stories passed down through families. For Filipinos, Samar represents the brutality of American colonialism, the willingness of American forces to use extreme violence against civilians, and the resistance of the Filipino people despite overwhelming force. For Americans, to the extent Samar is remembered at all, it's usually presented as a regrettable excess in an otherwise necessary war, or it's forgotten entirely. This asymmetry of memory reflects the different experiences and different stakes. The Philippines experienced colonialism. America just had a colony. The Philippines lost thousands of people on Samar. America lost one general's reputation and suffered some bad press. The parallels between Samar and later American military operations are striking and troubling. The strategy of population control through forced relocation used on Samar was used again in Vietnam with the Strategic Hamlet program. The destruction of villages and resources to deny them to insurgents happened in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. The use of harsh tactics, justified by the difficulty of fighting guerrillas, has been a constant refrain from Samar to the present. The gap between official rules that prohibit atrocities and field practices that tolerate or encourage them has persisted. The pattern of light accountability when atrocities become public has repeated. The military studied Samar and learned tactical lessons, but it didn't learn the deeper lesson that tactics like Smith employed are not just morally wrong, but strategically counterproductive, that they create more enemies than they eliminate, and that they undermine the political legitimacy necessary for lasting victory. The role of racism in enabling the Samar campaign cannot be ignored. Smith saw Filipinos as savages, as barely human, as people whose lives had little value. This racist worldview made it psychologically possible for him to order mass killing. If he had been ordered to do to white Europeans what he did to Filipinos, he would have refused. The racial element was central to his willingness to commit atrocities. The same racism infected American soldiers who carried out his orders. They used racial slurs constantly. They talked about Filipinos the way they talked about animals. This dehumanization made it easier to kill, easier to ignore suffering, easier to justify extreme violence. The racism that enabled the Samar campaign was not unique to Smith or to the military. It was pervasive in American society in 1901. The same attitudes that enabled Jim Crow at home enabled atrocities abroad. Understanding Samar requires understanding how racism functions to enable violence, how seeing other people as less than human makes it possible to treat them with cruelty that would be unthinkable if they were seen as fully human and equal. The question of what ordinary American soldiers thought about what they were doing on Samar is complicated by the fragmentary evidence. We have some letters, some testimony from courts-martial, some later memoirs. These sources show a range of responses. Some soldiers seem to embrace the harsh tactics, talking about revenge for Balangiga and satisfaction at burning villages. Others expressed discomfort or moral qualms, but continued to follow orders. A few refused specific orders or tried to help civilians, though usually in small ways that didn't significantly change the overall pattern. Most soldiers probably didn't think deeply about the morality of what they were doing. They were focused on survival, on following orders, on doing their jobs. The tendency of soldiers in combat to narrow their focus to immediate tasks and immediate threats, to not think too much about the bigger picture, is a well-documented psychological phenomenon. It helps soldiers function under stress, but it also makes it easier for them to participate in atrocities without fully confronting what they're doing. The officers who commanded at lower levels, the lieutenants and captains and majors who led companies and battalions, were the ones who directly implemented Smith's orders. Some did so enthusiastically, competing to see who could burn the most villages or kill the most suspects. Others tried to moderate the orders, protecting civilians where they could and focusing on actual guerrilla fighters rather than indiscriminate killing. The variation in how Smith's orders were implemented depended largely on these middle-level officers, on their interpretation of their orders and their own moral compasses. But even officers who tried to be more humane were constrained by Smith's emphasis on harshness and by the overall culture of the campaign that valued destruction and killing as measures of success. The aftermath of the campaign saw some efforts at reconstruction and reconciliation, but these were limited and came only after the destruction had achieved its purpose. The American colonial government provided some food aid to concentration camps to prevent complete starvation. They began rebuilding some infrastructure. They established schools and tried to win over the population through education and economic opportunity. But these positive efforts couldn't undo the damage. Trust had been destroyed along with the villages. The memory of the campaign shaped how the people of Samar viewed the colonial government for the entire colonial period. Even Filipinos who worked for the colonial administration, who taught in American schools, who participated in the political system, many harbored resentment about what had been done to their island. The Samar campaign ended officially in the spring of 1902 as American forces withdrew to coastal garrison towns and the civilian government took over administration. The active burning and killing stopped, though the deaths from starvation and disease continued for months afterward as survivors struggled to rebuild their lives with no homes, no food stores, and no tools. The guerrilla resistance was broken. The island was pacified in the sense that there were no more organized attacks on American forces. But the pacification was achieved through methods that left lasting scars and that would be recognized today as war crimes. General Jacob Smith retired in July 1902 after his court-martial. He lived quietly until his death in 1918, largely avoiding public attention. He never expressed public remorse for his orders or for the suffering they caused. In his view, he had done his duty, had pacified a difficult area using harsh but necessary measures, and had been scapegoated by politicians and anti-imperialists who didn't understand warfare. His legacy is one of the darkest in American military history. He represents how ordinary racism and institutional loyalty can combine to enable atrocities, how following orders can become a justification for the unjustifiable, and how systems protect their own even when protecting them requires tolerating mass violence against civilians. Major Waller continued his Marine career after his acquittal. He served in various capacities and retired as a Major General. He wrote memoirs that described his expedition across Samar and defended the execution of the Filipino guides as necessary under the circumstances. He remained convinced throughout his life that he had done nothing wrong, that war was hell, and that difficult decisions had to be made in the field. His career progression, despite his actions, sent a message about what the military actually valued versus what it officially prohibited. The Filipinos who led the resistance on Samar, those who survived, faced difficult choices after the campaign ended. Some surrendered and accepted American rule, seeing no alternative. Others fled to other islands and continued resistance there. A few managed to preserve some autonomy by retreating to remote areas where American control was minimal. But the organized resistance that had existed before the campaign was destroyed. The infrastructure of communication, the supply networks, the local support systems, all had been shattered by the systematic destruction. The broader impact of the Samar campaign on the Philippine-American War was significant. It broke resistance in one of the most difficult areas and demonstrated that America was willing to use extreme measures to achieve its goals. Other areas where resistance continued saw what happened on Samar, and many chose to surrender rather than face similar devastation. The campaign contributed to the overall end of the war in mid-1902, though at an enormous human cost. It showed that America could and would win its colonial war, but it also showed the ugly methods required to do so. The legal legacy of the Samar campaign and the courts-martial that followed is mixed. On one hand, the fact that Smith was court-martialed at all established the principle that even in colonial warfare, there are limits and that orders to commit atrocities are illegal. This principle would be cited in later cases involving war crimes. On the other hand, the light punishment sent the message that the principle wasn't really enforced, that going too far might get you retired but not imprisoned, and that the military protected its own. The gap between the principle and its enforcement has remained a feature of military justice in atrocity cases. The environmental and ecological impact of the Samar campaign lasted for generations. The deforestation changed the island's hydrology and climate patterns. The loss of agricultural knowledge, as experienced farmers died or fled and young people never learned traditional farming, meant that even after fields were replanted, productivity was lower. The disruption of fishing, the destruction of boats and nets, impacted coastal communities. Some ecosystems never fully recovered. Samar today is still among the poorer and less developed parts of the Philippines, and while this is due to many factors, the devastation of 1901–1902 is part of the explanation. Understanding Samar requires grappling with uncomfortable truths about warfare, about American history, about human nature. It requires acknowledging that people who think of themselves as good, who believe they're following legitimate orders and achieving important objectives, can commit terrible atrocities. It requires understanding that institutional structures and cultures can enable and encourage such atrocities by providing justifications and by failing to enforce accountability. It requires recognizing that racism functions to dehumanize and that dehumanization enables violence. It requires seeing how cycles of violence work, how attacks like Balangiga lead to retaliation, that vastly exceeds any reasonable sense of proportionality, and how that retaliation creates more grievances that fuel future violence. The Samar campaign should be taught in American schools as a cautionary tale about the costs of empire, about the dangers of dehumanizing enemies, about the gap between laws and their enforcement, about how ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil. It should be taught not to shame America, but to understand America, to learn from history rather than repeat it. The fact that most Americans have never heard of Samar, that Jacob Smith is not a household name the way that perpetrators of more famous atrocities are, shows how effectively this history has been forgotten or suppressed. That forgetting itself is revealing, showing how nations remember what serves their interests and forget what doesn't, how uncomfortable truths get buried under more comfortable narratives. For the people of Samar and their descendants, the campaign remains part of living memory passed down through generations. The stories of villages that disappeared, of ancestors who died in the camps or during the burning, of the suffering under American occupation, these stories are told and retold. They shape identity and understanding. They create complicated feelings toward America, mixing recognition of eventual Filipino independence and American aid with resentment of the brutality that began the relationship. These feelings can't be resolved or wished away. They're the legacy of historical trauma, and they persist across generations. The march across Samar, where General Jacob Smith ordered kill everyone over 10, was one of the darkest chapters in American military history. A systematic campaign of devastation that killed thousands of civilians and destroyed an entire island society and economy. It was enabled by racism, by the dehumanization of Filipinos, by a military culture that valued results over rules, and by a command structure that gave illegal orders and then protected those who followed them. It was justified at the time as necessary retaliation and as effective counterinsurgency, but it was neither. It was a war crime, and the light accountability that followed enabled future atrocities by showing that American soldiers and officers could commit terrible acts with minimal consequences. Understanding Samar, remembering Samar, learning from Samar, these are not just historical exercises. They're essential to understanding how ordinary people become killers, how institutions enable atrocity, and how nations must confront their pasts honestly if they want to build better futures.